Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Also consider joining my Patreon page for some cool perks. I'll leave a link in the description. You're just in time for a new episode of Rock and Read. I'm using a new mic, so let me know how everything sounds. Today you'll get to hear Chapter 17 of It's So Easy and Otherwise by Duff McKagan. Chapter 17 is called Appetite. Without further ado, why don't we find out what happens next? With my favorite punk bands, the bass was the loudest thing and led the way. And now as Mike Klink started to produce the songs that would make up Appetite, the bass was the loudest, roundest thing on the recordings. It had a lot of space. And it wasn't on the outside or underneath the way it was on a lot of records back then. Klink had it right in the middle. We were pretty disciplined about the sessions, but outside the recording studio, it was business as usual in our world. Partying, fighting, getting into scraps with the police. Half the band slept at the studio sporadically because they still didn't have beds anywhere else. Though I was actually moving in the opposite direction on the personal front. After a period without an exclusive relationship, I started to see a girl named Mandy. She was in a band called the Lame Flames. By spring 1987, as Guns was finishing the record, Mandy and I moved in together. Our apartment became an oasis of stability, not just for me and Mandy, but for people around me, like Todd Crew. His band Jet Boy had just signed a major label deal. Whenever people needed to find Todd, his band, their management, his family, they called my number. Now that I had an actual phone instead of having to use a payphone, I was also able to call home a lot more. I talked to my mom frequently, excited to tell her about Mandy and the foundation I seemed to be building with her. For the first time since Stacy, I feel as if I'm in a relationship with long-term potential, Mom. I talked to Big Jim a lot more too. He'd continued to write me. Always managing to track down my latest address, as I lived like a nomad during those 2 years since the trip up to Seattle for GNR's ill-fated Shakeout tour. Jim confided in me during some of those long conversations that he was thinking of moving down to LA. I was psyched at the prospect of having another solid friend around. Once the Appetite sessions were over, we needed another outlet as we waited for all the peripheral stuff to get done. The record wouldn't be released until July. Axl, Izzy, and Slash went to New York to sit in on the mixing process. I started playing rhythm guitar in a side band called Drunk, just screwing around with various friends. One afternoon, Todd was sitting in my apartment when my phone rang. Jet Boy's manager was on the line. I handed the phone to Todd. The conversation didn't last long. Todd looked devastated as he hung up. "What's wrong?" I asked. "They just kicked me out." "What the are you talking about?" "I'm no longer the bass player in Jet Boy. They fired me." "What? That's all he said?" "He said they decided I drink too much and hang out with the Guns N' Roses guys too much." Todd was absolutely crestfallen. The payoff for several years of hard work had suddenly been jerked away from him at the last minute. At the time, I was royally pissed off at Jet Boy. In essence, they fired Todd for being too up. It ruined the camaraderie we had with that band. Unfortunately, we would face a similarly heartbreaking situation within our own band in a few short years. For the short term, Todd joined Drunk, which now consisted of him on bass, me on rhythm guitar, Steven Adler on drums, Del singing, and Wes Darkeen on lead guitar. Then I realized I hadn't heard from Jim in quite a few days. I couldn't seem to reach him, so I started calling a few other Seattle people to see what the story was. But then, my phone rang. It was Jim's girlfriend. She was crying. Jim had died of a heroin overdose. At first, I didn't understand. He wrote me letters. He sent me pictures. He was coming to LA. Now he was dead. Oh, God. My heart sank. It felt as if something inside me had been ripped out. "Why didn't you move to LA before this happened, Jim?" I flew home for Jim's funeral in Seattle. All my old feelings about heroin came flooding back. Joe, who had urged me to get out of town 3 years prior, spoke at Jim's funeral. And, as he eulogized yet another overdose victim, Joe himself was clearly nodding out. Seeing my old friend and roommate Eddie again at the funeral, I was really scared he might be next. It was clear he was what people called a to-die junkie, the kind who just couldn't stop no matter what. Only death would break the habit of a to-die junkie. But there was no time to hunker down and reflect on the events. Guns N' Roses was on our way to London. The gig came about because of our Live Like a Suicide EP, released 6 months before in December 1986. The EP was a fast and furious collection of songs, 2 originals and 2 covers. At the time, we were relieved to have anything out on vinyl. By the way, the crowd noise on that EP is from recordings of a 1970s rock festival called the Texas Jam. We thought it would be funny to put a huge stadium crowd in the background at a time when we were lucky to be playing to a few hundred, but the EP didn't make a stir anywhere in the world, except, we soon found out, in Britain. Unbeknownst to us, a cult following was building over there and was champing at the bit for any news about the band. When Kerrang! Magazine sent a photographer over to Los Angeles to shoot us for a cover article in early 1987, we had been completely baffled. Kerrang! Was the biggest rock magazine in the UK. We had received some local press coverage in LA at this point, but Kerrang! We were half convinced somebody was playing a prank on us, but the photographer showed up and the article ran. Then a London concert promoter had contacted us and asked us to play the famous Marquee Club in June, before the release of Appetite. Up to then, the only place I had been outside of the United States was Vancouver, Canada, to play punk rock shows with my various Seattle bands when I was a teenager. So this was big news to me. Huge, magnificent. Kids in the UK would sort of latch onto one band and make a big deal out of it. In the mid-1980s, that band was Hanoi Rocks, an amazing group of Finns who had relocated to England and were writing some of the best and dirtiest rock on the planet. When Hanoi came to tour America in 1984, their drummer died in a car crash while making a booze run with Vince Neil of Mötley Crüe during a few days off in LA that December. I had just moved to Hollywood that fall, and Slash and I had tickets to the Hanoi Rocks gig that never happened because of the car accident. It was an incredibly sad moment in rock and roll, and Hanoi Rocks never recovered. They broke up soon afterward. Flash forward to our gig in the UK in June 1987. After the first marquee gig sold out in record time, they added a second date. That sold out just as fast, so they added a third night. By the time we arrived in London, we were minor celebrities. We discovered we had become the it band the youth of England had been looking for to fill the void left by Hanoi Rocks. We stayed in a rent-by-the-week apartment because it was much cheaper than a hotel, and at times people would stop us on the street. They actually knew who we were. It was a weird sensation, even on such a small scale. I learned to ride London's subway system, the Tube, because there were great gigs every night we were there. Slash and I went out one night to see the Replacements and got so drunk that when we caught the Tube after the show, we ended up on a train heading the wrong way. When we arrived at the end of the line, there were no more trains running, and we didn't have anywhere near enough money to take a cab back. And anyway, we didn't know the address where we were staying. We only knew how to get there from our local tube shop. We ended up sloppily swinging at each other out of frustration before passing out in the train station. The real reason we were there, of course, was to rock. In that period of the band's career, and with pent-up energy from half a year of virtually no gigs, nobody rocked with as much purpose and sneer, or with the same level of recklessness and bad intentions. This is not me bragging. We were just firing on all cylinders. At soundcheck before the first show on June 19, 1987, we ran through a cover song. We played it just once, but somehow our feelings found a perfect vessel in this Bob Dylan song, and our emotions just came pouring out. Todd Crew showed up unexpectedly that day. He was bumming around Europe on a Eurail pass he had gotten for graduation, but never used, and he told us he was blown away by the way we played the song. When we walked to the marquee that first night for the show itself, we were met by a crowd filling up the entire block, and we were absolutely amazed that all these people had come to see us. Trusting Todd's judgment, we ended up closing the show with the cover song we had tried during sound check that afternoon, Knockin' on Heaven's Door. We all hung out in the street in front of the Marquee after that show, and before and after the next 2 gigs. We felt awed by our reception. When we arrived back in the States in early July, nothing was happening for us. We took an opening slot on a tour with the Colt, a British band with goth roots. They had had success with She Sells Sanctuary off their second album, Love, and beginning in mid-August, they were touring across Canada and the western United States for their third album, Electric. With our record coming out, we would have a small budget for a crew, so Todd Crew and I hatched a plan. He would come out on the Colt tour and be my bass tech. He could make some money working the tour and then return to LA and start a new band. There was still a month or so to kill. Slash went off to meet with merchandising companies in New York City just prior to the US release of Appetite. Todd got a wild and drunken hair up his ass and flew out to New York to join him. Todd thought it'd be a fun last hurrah before he had to sober up a bit to work the tour, I guess. Todd always called me about 8 times a day, and that didn't change when he went to New York. But then the calls stopped. I thought that maybe he had found some girl and was holed up in her apartment without a phone. But that wasn't it. At 3 o'clock on a Sunday morning, my phone rang. The sound woke me up from a deep sleep. I picked up the phone and heard Todd's mother's voice. "Duff, please tell me Todd is at your apartment with you. Please tell me he's there." What? I had no idea what she was talking about, and I was still rubbing my half-closed eyes. "Todd is not dead? He can't be!" she shrieked. Now I was completely dumbstruck. The New York Police Department's coroner had called her to tell her that they had her son's body. He had died of a heroin overdose, the coroner had told her. "It can't be true. He'll come bursting through the door any minute now." I made some frantic calls. It was true. Todd was gone. Gone. To this day, it is hard to talk or even think about. At the time, all I knew was that 2 of my best friends had suddenly been washed from this earth in quick succession. First Jim, and then Todd. I felt as if I had been left to swim upstream in a world that was getting darker and darker all the time. I didn't know where to turn. Eddie was unavailable. Andy was 1,000 miles away. My mom was always on the other end of the phone, but I still felt suddenly lost. I feel so alone. I had moved in with my girlfriend Mandy a few months before. Now, I asked her to marry me. Premature for sure, but I needed to try to create something solid to shore up the foundations of my existence. She said yes. Guns N' Roses started the Colt tour in Halifax on August 14th with shows almost every night for a little over a month. Halifax is in Nova Scotia, in the easternmost corner of Canada. Despite everything else, it was an exciting prospect. Nobody in my family had ever been out to Nova Scotia. Nobody I knew had ever been out there before. I was going to be the first. Every time there was a first like that, I used to think to myself that I should savor this moment. It would also be the first time ever that I was part of a highly organized campaign behind the release of a record. We had a tour bus. We had a couple of real hotel rooms and catering. Yes! Backstage the first night of the tour, I saw Billy Duffy, the Colt's guitar player, sitting down at dinner at one of the tables in the catering room. I gave him a sort of half-assed dude nod, in the hopes that maybe he knew my name. You know, he's Duffy, I'm Duff, and that we would have a conversation starter. Nope, didn't happen. He just saw some tall geezer with a strange tic. He ignored me and went on about his business of eating his dinner. I felt like a complete goof. Hitting the stage that night was extra special. It did not matter in the slightest that there were maybe 50 people in the audience when we took that stage. One thing I hadn't reckoned on were the barricades between the stage and the audience, leaving a ton of space where the building's security personnel could gather and show their force. Because of that gap, the stage lights did not illuminate the few people in attendance, and all those lights were blinding. The overall effect was to make us feel like we were playing to this big, yawning void. We decided to add Knockin' on Heaven's Door to our set as a tribute to Todd, who had loved it so much the first time we played it back in England. When we played it on stage the first night of the tour, the song's sentiments were further magnified our decision to use it as a way of publicly acknowledging the death of our friend. We had filmed a video for Welcome to the Jungle just before we left on the Colt tour, but MTV refused to air it, so nobody knew who we were. In fact, the Canadian release date for Appetite was 6 weeks later than the US release date for some reason, so our record wasn't even available until halfway through the tour. We continued to play to empty rooms because nobody turned up for the opening act. After our set each night, I would go into the audience and bum Canadian quarters to call home on the venue's payphone. Mandy, my mom, my friends back in Seattle, they all got to hear about the strange mix of elation and tragedy that accompanied me across Canada. From Canada, we swung down the west coast of the United States. When we played the Paramount Theater in Seattle, I got a bunch of my friends in for free. Seeing Kurt and Kim and Donner and Andy and Brian again put me somewhat at ease, though Eddie was still strung out. Andy Wood came and brought Stone Gossard and Jeff Ament. They were in the process of putting together Mother Love Bone. Jerry Cantrell and Sean Kinney from Alice in Chains came too, and I got a chance to stop by my mom's the day after the show. The next tour stop, where any people came early enough to see Guns play our set, was at the Long Beach Arena. It was a homecoming show for us after not playing there much that year, but the rest of the tour, which then went east to New Orleans, via Arizona and Texas, nobody knew us, and nobody cared. A few days after the Colt tour wrapped in mid-September, we went as a headlining act to Germany and Holland and then back to the UK. I was sick as a dog in Amsterdam with the flu. I was sharing a room with Izzy and Slash, and they got a hold of some heroin and smoked it. For some reason, despite Jim and Todd's death just months before, when they offered me the tinfoil contraption they were using to smoke it, I accepted. When I inhaled, it felt as if I floated away on a silk pillow. It was the perfect antidote to the flu, but I was still a drinker, not a junkie, and I wouldn't touch heroin again for quite a few years. In Britain, we played in Newcastle, Nottingham, Manchester, Brazil. Returning to London on October 8th, 3 months after our first visit, we had a date at the Hammersmith Odeon. This was a huge step up. It was a legendary theater. Both The Clash and Motorhead had written songs about the place. When I found out we would be playing the Hammersmith Odeon, I thought to myself, whoa, that's it. We've made it. When we came back to the States, we played our first ever East Coast gigs, headlining a small-scale tour in places like Allentown and Albany. It was a bare-bones operation, one bus and a rider truck for our gear. In clubs, the lights and sound were already installed, and you got what you got. Good or bad, you couldn't do anything about it. We just hoped the places had a shower we could use. We played the Ritz in New York City for the first time. The buzz about us seemed finally to be building in New York. We played another show at the famous Brooklyn hardcore club, L'Amour, billed only as mystery guests. Rumors that it would be us were enough to fill the place, and we did an acoustic set at CBGB on October 30th, 1987, where we debuted Patience. Next, we nabbed a slot on Mötley Crüe's Girls, Girls, Girls tour starting in Alabama in November. The Crew had a big production show. Tommy Lee was in a spinning drum riser on a crane arm that could rotate him 360 degrees. Our backline was tiny, just a few amps in my bass rig. After we dumped our gear at each stop, we just waited around while they set up. We ate the free backstage food and started cocktail hour. We could only get on stage a little while before the doors opened and do a quick sound check. Our setup was barely visible in front of the Crew's Kiss Scale stage set, and at one point our manager wanted to bring out dummy Marshall stacks and make it look huge. We said, no way! It wasn't about the backline. It wasn't about video, lighting, or dry ice smoke. It was about us. We had 45 minutes as an opening band, and we just tried to kill it every night. Back in the Halcyon days of GNR, when everyone in LA thought we were the most badass, hard-drinking, and hard-drugging mother***ers around, and maybe we thought so too, we quickly found out we were in the minor league compared to Mötley Crüe. After their shows, we often ended up partying together, learning their code names for different drugs, even flying on their private jet a few times. Our peek into their world was a look into an abyss. They'd found a way of skating around the edge of that abyss, while perfecting the dark art of drinking and drugging for a while there back in the 1980s. My brother Bruce, the one who first got me started playing bass, now worked for a music management company. He tracked the pop charts as part of his job, and he tracked guns because of me. He kept all the weekly Billboard magazines. He watched Appetite for Destruction creep from the high hundreds up to 110. He called me when we cracked the top 100. "Brother, you're 95!" After a quick interview on MTV's weekly late-night metal show, Headbangers Ball, the video for Welcome to the Jungle was finally getting some plays on MTV, and audiences on the Crew tour were receptive to our sound. In December, we joined Alice Cooper's tour as the opening band for the opening band. The bill went us, Megadeth, and Alice. That meant going through the Midwest in a bus playing in front of 2 bands' gear. We finished the year with 4 homecoming shows at Perkins Palace in Pasadena. Whew, what a year. Our first album, our first taste of national and international touring, CBGBs, and the Hammersmith Odeon. It had all been very exciting. In my case, the fulfillment of dreams I had had since I had started playing in bands at 15. But I had also found that flying triggered panic attacks. Sometimes the attacks were so bad that I couldn't see, couldn't breathe. I would sweat profusely. I wanted to take off my clothes, but at the same time, I was freezing because my breathing was so shallow. It felt like I was going to suffocate. People around me, the guys in the band, friends, could see the frantic look on my face, but there was nothing they could do to help me. I began to drink heavily prior to our increasingly frequent flights. The trick was to be able to walk straight during boarding, but pass out as soon as they sealed the aircraft doors. Yeah, what a year. I had lost dear friends. In fact, practically every triumph had been tempered by a deep sense of loss. Well, that's the end of Chapter 17. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 17 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.